April 2001, Skidmore, Missouri. A quiet farming town with a population so small, everyone knows everyone else. The kind of place where neighbors wave across porches and gossip spreads faster than the mail. But underneath that small-town calm, Skidmore has always carried a dark legacy, a town with secrets, violence, and whispers of things left unsolved. On this spring afternoon, 20-year-old Branson Perry was home with a friend. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just small chores around a house his father owned. At some point, Branson grabbed a set of jumper cables, telling his friend he was going to return them to the shed outside. His friend stayed inside, expecting him to come right back. But Branson never returned. Minutes passed, then hours. At first, it seemed odd but not alarming. After all, Skidmore was the kind of place where people wandered off, visited neighbors, or went out for drives without saying much. But as the evening fell, Branson's absence became impossible to ignore. When family and friends began searching, they found no trace of him. The house was still in order. His wallet, his car, his personal belongings, all untouched. It looked as though Branson had simply stepped out into his own backyard and vanished into thin air. The strangest clue of all would appear later. Those same jumper cables Branson carried out were mysteriously returned to the shed. No one could explain how they got there, or who had placed them back. It was as if someone wanted to remind the world that Branson had been taken, but not explain why. In a town already scarred by a violent past, another nightmare had begun. And for Branson Perry's family, it was the start of a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Before the mystery, before the headlines, before his name became another haunting case file, Branson Perry was just a young man trying to find his place in the world. Born in 1981, Branson grew up in Skidmore, Missouri, a small town with fewer than 300 residents. Life here was quiet, predictable, and often harsh. Branson's childhood was not an easy one. His father, Bob Perry, struggled with legal issues and spent time in prison. His mother, Becky, battled serious health problems, including a debilitating heart condition that made daily life difficult. Because of this, Branson grew up quickly. Friends described him as kind, polite, and helpful. He didn't have a flashy personality, but he was dependable. The type of young man who would mow a neighbor's lawn without being asked or lend a hand if someone's car broke down. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he had a quiet warmth that made people trust him. Physically, Branson was lean, about 5 feet 9 inches tall, with light hair and blue eyes. His appearance was ordinary, but his disappearance would make him unforgettable. Despite his hardships, Branson tried to stay upbeat. He had recently dyed his hair blonde and was working on odd jobs to help his family. He was also deeply devoted to his mother, often taking care of the house when her health failed. Those close to him say that Branson's greatest wish was simple: stability, a life that felt normal, away from the shadows of crime and illness that had touched his family. Yet beneath the surface, Branson also carried his own private struggles. Some accounts suggest that he was exploring his identity, including his sexuality, in a town that wasn't always kind people who stood out. Skidmore, after all, was a place where secrets lingered in silence, and difference often carried risk. Still, for those who love him, Branson was not a symbol or a mystery. He was a son, a friend, and a young man with a whole life ahead of him. On that April afternoon in 2001, no one imagined that Branson's simple decision to put away jumper cables would become the last moment anyone ever saw him alive. This was not just a disappearance. It was a sudden erasure of a life filled with potential, leaving only questions, grief, and a silence that Skidmore has carried for decades. April 11th, 2001 began like any other spring day in Skidmore, Missouri. The town streets were quiet, dotted with a few pickup trucks, front porches with rocking chairs, and neighbors tending to their lawns. Nothing about the morning gave any hint that tragedy was about to unfold. Branson Perry, 20 years old, was at home on the north side of Skidmore. His father, Bob Perry, was away, and his mother, Becky, was in the hospital recovering from a minor medical procedure. That left Branson in charge of the house. That afternoon, a friend stopped by to help Branson clean and do some chores. Together, they worked around the house, tidying up and running small tasks. It was all routine, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. At some point during the day, the two went outside. Branson mentioned the jumper cables that had been used earlier. He picked them up, saying he was going to put them back into the shed behind the house. His friend stayed inside, expecting him to return within minutes. But Branson never came back. At first, it might have seemed like nothing. Maybe he got distracted. Maybe he wanted to talk to a neighbor. Maybe he decided to leave for a short errand. In a small town, people drift in and out of each other's homes without much explanation. But as minutes stretched into an hour, his absence became unsettling. His friend began looking around. The shed was empty. Branson wasn't outside. His car, parked in the driveway, hadn't moved. His wallet and personal belongings were untouched inside the house. It was as if Branson had simply walked off the face of the earth. That night, when Branson still hadn't come home, concern turned into panic. His mother, still recovering in the hospital, was notified. Neighbors began asking questions. Where had Branson gone? In the days that followed, the story grew stranger. The same jumper cables Branson had taken to the shed were mysteriously returned. No one saw who brought them back. No one admitted to touching them. But there they were, neatly placed in the shed, as if someone wanted to send a message. This single detail transformed the case from a missing persons report into something far more chilling. Whoever was responsible for Branson's disappearance had not only taken him, they had come back. From that moment, Skidmore became gripped by fear and suspicion. And for Branson's family, the nightmare had only just begun. To understand the disappearance of Branson Perry, you have to understand Skidmore itself. Because this was not just any small town. This was a place already marked by fear, by violence, and by a history that seemed to cast a shadow over everyone who lived there. Skidmore, Missouri, population just a few hundred, is remembered across America for one event: the killing of Ken Rex McElroy. Back in 1981, McElroy was known as a town bully, a man who terrorized neighbors for years with thefts, threats, and violence. He was accused of assault, harassment, and countless crimes, but somehow always evaded prison, slipping through loopholes in the law. For Skidmore's residents, McElroy was not just a problem. He was a nightmare. On July 10th, 1981, after yet another confrontation, the people of Skidmore had had enough. In broad daylight, in the middle of town, Ken Rex McElroy was shot dead while sitting in his truck. Dozens of witnesses were present. But when police arrived, not a single one admitted to seeing who pulled the trigger. The killing made national headlines. Some called it vigilante justice. Others called it murder. But the most chilling part was what came after. No one was ever charged. The entire town stayed silent. From that day on, Skidmore wasn't just another farming community. It became infamous, a place where the rules of justice bent and where silence could bury the truth. And Branson Perry's disappearance, 2 decades later, seemed to echo that same darkness. In 2001, when Branson vanished, investigators were already aware of Skidmore's reputation. The town's code of silence, its unwillingness to talk, and its history of secrets created a dangerous atmosphere. It wasn't just that Branson was gone. It was that Skidmore was the kind of place where someone could vanish, and nobody would admit to knowing why. For Branson's family, this history was a cruel weight. They weren't just searching for a missing son. They were fighting against a legacy of silence that had protected killers before. And as days turned into weeks, it became clear. In Skidmore, Missouri, the truth was never simple. As the days turned into weeks with no sign of Branson Perry, investigators were left with fragments, a few witness statements, the eerie clue of the returned jumper cables, and a long list of unanswered questions. Who would want to harm a quiet 20-year-old man? And why? Theories began to emerge, some rooted in facts, others in the rumors and dark reputation of Skidmore itself. At first, police considered the possibility of random foul play. Branson could have walked outside and crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong time. Maybe a stranger passing through town. Maybe someone with a grudge. But there was a problem with this theory. Skidmore wasn't a busy place. It wasn't a highway town where strangers came and went. For someone to cross paths with Branson in his own backyard, in broad daylight, would have been unusual. Some investigators pointed to Skidmore's growing reputation for drug activity in the early 2000s. Methamphetamine use and distribution were creeping into rural Missouri, and Branson's disappearance raised a question. Had he stumbled into something he shouldn't have seen? Certain names surfaced in connection with drug trafficking in the area. Whispers suggested that Branson might have known people involved. Could he have been silenced for what he knew? But again, no evidence tied him directly to drug deals, and police struggled to prove anything. Another angle focused on Branson's personal life. Some believe he was exploring his identity, including his sexuality, in a town that was not always accepting. Could Branson have confided in the wrong person? Could someone have targeted him because of who he was, or because he trusted them too much? This theory carried painful weight because it underscored how vulnerable Branson may have felt in his own hometown. One name would later cast a chilling shadow over the case. Shane Stinnett, a man connected to child pornography crimes, who admitted to investigators that he had held parties in Skidmore involving exploitation. Authorities questioned whether Stinnett, or others like him, could have targeted Branson. But once again, nothing was proven, and Stinnett was never charged in relation to Branson's disappearance. And then there was the most bizarre detail of all, the jumper cables. The fact that they had been returned to the shed after Branson's disappearance suggested something deliberate. Whoever took Branson wanted people to know he had been there, but not what had happened to him. Was it a taunt, a message, or just a strange coincidence? What haunted investigators most was not just the lack of evidence, but the silence. People in Skidmore talked among themselves, but few came forward. It was as if the whole town was watching, waiting, but unwilling to break the code of secrecy that had defined Skidmore for decades. And as months passed, the theories only multiplied, but answers never came. If there is one single detail that makes Branson Perry's disappearance so uniquely haunting, it's the jumper cables. It seemed so simple, so ordinary. A young man stepping out to put a pair of cables in a shed. But what happened next, and the way those cables reappeared, turned the object into a dark symbol of the mystery itself. The very last thing anyone saw Branson do was carry those cables out of the house. He told his friend he was putting them away. He walked into the spring sunlight of April 11th, 2001, crossed the yard and stepped into the small shed. He never came back. That action, something so mundane, so everyday, became the line that separated the known from the unknown. Days later, investigators made a shocking discovery. The jumper cables were back in the shed, but not immediately, not right away. They were returned sometime after Branson vanished. Someone had placed them there. That single act transformed the case. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a message. Theories about the cables range from chilling to bizarre. A killer's signature. Whoever took Branson wanted people to know they had been there, but not what they had done. It was a calculated move, a way to taunt investigators. A cover-up. Maybe the killer hoped to make it look like Branson had never left the shed at all, or to erase the clue of his last action. A personal message. Some believe the return of the cables was symbolic, a way of saying, I control this story, not you. For detectives, this detail was maddening. It meant that someone in town, someone who had accessed a yard, felt bold enough to return to the scene. Not only had they taken Branson, but they had also walked back into his world, into his home, without fear. It was a brazen act, and it deepened a chilling sense that Branson's disappearance was not random. It was deliberate, personal. But when investigators pressed, no one admitted to seeing anything. Not the neighbors, not the townsfolk. No one. In Skidmore, silence was nothing new. This was the same town where people had once witnessed a man being murdered in broad daylight, and not a single witness came forward. That same silence now surrounded Branson's case, and the jumper cable sat there in the shed, ordinary and quiet, but holding within them the most terrifying question of all. Who put them back? And what had they done with Branson Perry? In 1981, Skidmore became infamous across America. Ken Rex McElroy, a local bully and alleged criminal, had terrorized the town for years. Assaults, thefts, threats, the list was endless. No one felt safe when McElroy was near. He was the kind of man who could shoot at someone in broad daylight and walk away free, because witnesses were too scared to testify. But then, one hot July day, everything changed. McElroy was shot dead in his truck, in the middle of town, in broad daylight. Dozens of people saw it happen, and yet not a single witness came forward. To this day, no one has ever been charged with his murder. Skidmore learned something that day. Silence can be protection. Silence can be power. But McElroy's murder was just the beginning of Skidmore's dark reputation. 1994. Wendy Gillenwater, a young woman, was beaten to death in a brutal attack that shocked the community. 2000. Bobby Jo Stinnett, a pregnant dog breeder, was strangled in her home. Her unborn child was cut from her womb. The case horrified the nation. Skidmore wasn't just unlucky. It was cursed with violence. When Branson disappeared in 2001, investigators had to confront that history. Here was a town where people closed ranks, where witnesses kept their mouths shut, where crimes could unfold in daylight, and yet the truth could vanish into silence. Was Branson Perry another victim of Skidmore's violent legacy? Another casualty in a place where justice was swallowed by fear? Neighbors whispered. Families locked their doors. And when police knocked, people hesitated. Some locals admitted quietly that Branson's disappearance wasn't shocking. Not here, not in Skidmore. Violence was part of the air they breathed, but no one wanted to say more. The jumper cables, the silence, the town's history, it all combined to make Branson's disappearance one of the most haunting mysteries Missouri had ever seen. Because in Skidmore, truth doesn't just hide, it disappears. With Branson Perry gone without a trace, investigators were left with fragments. The cables, the silence, and the chilling history of Skidmore. But as weeks turned into months, a disturbing question loomed. Who took Branson and why? At first, police looked inward toward Branson's own circle, his friends, his acquaintances, and anyone who might have had a grudge. Was this a random abduction? Or did someone close to him know far more than they admitted? Theories split quickly. Some believed Branson's disappearance was tied to drugs, others to personal relationships, and some whispered darker possibilities. A few locals mentioned seeing strangers around the house in the days before Branson vanished. But those accounts were vague, shadowy, and often retracted. One theory suggested that Branson stumbled into something he wasn't meant to see or know, and was silenced for it. But without bodies, witnesses, or confessions, the trail was ice cold. Some investigators quietly noted a chilling parallel. The town's most infamous case, Ken Rex McElroy's murder. Just as no one had spoken then, no one was speaking now. It was as if silence was a second suspect, a living, breathing accomplice that covered up crimes. Years later, a new name surfaced, Dennis "Denny" O'Grady, a man with a disturbing history of sexual assault and violence. O'Grady had been connected to multiple troubling incidents in the area. In 2004, he was convicted of kidnapping and assault. Investigators began to wonder, had O'Grady crossed paths with Branson? Could he have lured the young man away under false pretenses? Some detectives believed O'Grady was the most credible suspect, but without a body, without evidence, prosecutors couldn't move forward. Other theories spread like wildfire. Sex trafficking. Some feared Branson was taken by traffickers, disappearing into a hidden network. Drug-related retaliation. Others suspected a deal gone wrong, with Branson paying the price. A message to the town. Still others thought his disappearance was symbolic, a warning, just like the jumper cables. Every theory added layers to the mystery, but none provided the closure Branson's family needed. By the mid-2000s, the case had drawn federal attention. The FBI reviewed files, conducted interviews, and tracked leads. Yet still, nothing. Branson's trail ended at the shed, and everything beyond it was shadows. Theories piled up. Suspects came and went, but the truth stayed buried. For Branson Perry's family, the days after his disappearance blurred into weeks, then months, and then years. But the anguish never dulled. His parents, Bob and Rebecca Perry, lived in a state of unbearable limbo, caught between hope and despair. Unlike families who lose loved ones to accidents or illness, the Perrys had no answers, no grave to visit, no final words. Rebecca Perry once described it as a wound that never heals because it's never closed. Every ring of the phone was a potential breakthrough. Every knock at the door could be the answer, but more often than not, it was nothing, just silence. In those first months, Branson's parents pleaded publicly for his safe return. They distributed flyers, worked with police, and even spoke to media, begging for leads. His father, Bob, once said, "If anyone knows where my boy is, please, just tell us. Don't let us live like this." But the tips were few, and the credible ones even fewer. Over time, the search took its toll. Rebecca Perry developed health issues, worsened by stress and grief. Bob carried himself with quiet determination, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a man who had been searching for too long. Family gatherings felt incomplete, holidays hollow. There was always an empty chair, a reminder of the son who should have been there. Despite the pain, the Perrys refused to let Branson's name fade into obscurity. They organized community vigils, spoke with crime advocacy groups, and partnered with organizations for missing persons. Every candle lit at those vigils was a flicker of hope, a refusal to let Branson's case disappear into the silence that had swallowed so much of Skidmore's history. Occasionally, the national media would shine a light back onto the case. True crime shows, documentaries, and articles retold Branson's story. Each time, the Perrys prayed that maybe, just maybe, someone watching would hold the missing piece of the puzzle. But even with the exposure, the mystery endured. As years passed, the family began to face the unbearable reality. Branson may never come home. But even then, they longed for one thing above all else: the truth, to know what happened, to finally have answers. Rebecca once said, "Even if Branson is gone, I just want to bring him home. I want to lay him to rest, not in my mind, but in the ground." It was a cry of a mother whose life had been consumed by the not knowing. As the years stretched into decades, Branson Perry's case refused to fade away. Unlike many cold cases that quietly gathered dust, his story continued to resurface, each time reigniting questions, frustrations, and the faint hope of resolution. In the mid-2000s, Missouri law enforcement and the FBI revisited the Perry disappearance. Files were pulled, evidence was reviewed, and witnesses were re-interviewed. One detail remained at the center: the jumper cables. Detectives believed those cables held the key, but without forensic evidence, they were little more than a ghost of a lead. By the 2010s, advancements in DNA and digital forensics gave investigators new avenues to explore. Items once overlooked or deemed too degraded were retested. Authorities hoped that technology might succeed where human silence had failed. But even with state-of-the-art labs, no smoking gun emerged. The case remained maddeningly elusive. The explosion of true crime media in the 2010s and 2020s gave Branson's case renewed life. Podcasts, documentaries, and online forums revisited his disappearance. Each retelling brought in fresh eyes, fresh theories, and occasionally new tips. Some tips were credible enough to follow up on. Others were pure speculation. But investigators welcomed the attention, because silence had gotten them nowhere. One lead that remained consistent was Dennis "Denny" O'Grady, the violent offender who had a known history of kidnapping and abuse. In later years, law enforcement confirmed that O'Grady was a person of interest. Some even believe he had confessed indirectly while in prison, though never enough to make charges stick. Still, O'Grady died in 2014, taking whatever secrets he held with him. Theories about Branson's fate continued to swirl. Murder and concealment. The most widely accepted belief was that Branson had been murdered and his body hidden somewhere in the dense Missouri countryside. Cover-up. Some suspected that more than one person was involved, and that Skidmore's notorious silence was, once again, protecting the guilty, a symbolic disappearance. For others, the returned jumper cables symbolized a message that Branson's fate wasn't random. It was a warning. In recent years, investigators hinted that technology and new witness statements had produced promising leads. Though no details have been publicly revealed, officials stress that the case remains active. For Branson's family, it's a double-edged sword. Hope, yes, but also endless waiting. As of today, Branson Perry remains missing. His case is officially classified as a disappearance, But most know it's more than that. It's a murder without a body, a crime without a witness, a story that refuses to close. Skidmore, Missouri is more than just a dot on the map. To outsiders, it has become a symbol, a place synonymous with secret silence and violence. And Branson Perry's disappearance is woven deeply into that dark reputation. When journalists write about Skidmore, they rarely speak of its farms, its families, or its small-town charm. Instead, they speak of murder, mystery, and crimes that seem almost unbelievable for a town so small. The death of Ken Rex McElroy, the brutal killing of Wendy Gillenwater, the horrifying murder of Bobby Joe Stinnett, and the disappearance of Branson Perry. For crimes that stained Skidmore forever and gave it a legacy of fear for the rest of the world, Skidmore became a cautionary tale, a place where justice seems absent, where silence speaks louder than words. Branson's case only deepened that perception. A young man could walk into his own backyard in broad daylight and vanish, and still no one would speak. To many, it seemed Skidmore was cursed. Over the years, Branson's story was retold in documentaries, books, podcasts, and news specials. Each one painted a haunting picture of a town trapped by its past. Audiences were left asking, how can so many violent crimes happen in one place? And more importantly, why is no one ever truly held accountable? For those who live in Skidmore, the reputation has been a burden. Many residents resent the media attention, claiming their community has been unfairly defined by tragedy. And yet, they cannot deny that their silence, their refusal to come forward in some of the most shocking crimes in modern history, has shaped the narrative. Branson's disappearance became part of that narrative, another story where the truth seemed buried under silence. Today, Skidmore is not just remembered for its crimes. It is remembered for a culture of silence that allowed them to linger. Branson Perry's name is now inseparable from that legacy. His disappearance represents not just one family's pain, but an entire town's shadow, a shadow that stretches across decades. Branson Perry's story is not just a mystery. It is a wound that is never healed. For his family, for investigators, and for anyone who dares to look closely at the silence of Skidmore, it all began with something so small, so ordinary, a pair of jumper cables. Branson wasn't running away. He wasn't planning something reckless. He was simply doing a chore, helping a friend, living his life. And yet, in the space between the shed and the yard, he vanished. That detail, so simple, so haunting, has kept this case alive for more than 2 decades. To this day, the questions remain. Who returned the jumper cables? Why did no one in Skidmore speak up? Did Branson cross paths with a predator, or was his disappearance a message, a warning to others? And the hardest question of all, where's Branson now? Each question hangs in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to ignore. For Branson's loved ones, the nightmare is not just that he is gone. It is that they have never been able to say goodbye. His mother's words echo across the years. Even if Branson is gone, I just want to bring him home. It is a plea that countless families of the missing understand all too well, the desperate need for closure. Branson Perry's case is also a reminder of the fragility of safety, the dangers of silence, and the importance of speaking out. In towns and cities across the world, cases like his remain unsolved. Not because answers don't exist, but because they remain locked away, hidden in fear or indifference. Justice demands more than evidence. It demands courage. Today, Branson Perry's case remains officially open. Investigators still encourage tips. His family still waits for answers. And for the rest of us, his story serves as a haunting reminder. Sometimes the most ordinary moments can turn into the darkest mysteries. Branson Perry's name must not fade. His story must not be forgotten. Because somewhere, someone knows what happened on that quiet April day in Skidmore, Missouri. And until the truth comes to light, the questions will never rest.